Hey guys, I decided because uh, my mental illness not real series was getting rather long, that I would here. Let me share the screen with you. That I would just respond to the rest of it on a live stream because that's going to be a lot easier than editing five 30 to 45-minute videos. I just don't have time for that. So let me try and find. There we go. Let me share this. And I will, here we go, application window. Okay. Let me just share this on Facebook. Okay. I'm just trying to get the link so I can share this on Facebook. But after that, I'll just be responding to the video. So hopefully this will get you the, there we go. Just give me a minute here. Oh, somebody sent me more fan art. Thank you for that. Just there we go. Oh, that's cool. That's really cool. Let me just get that fan art. Thank you for drawing that for me. There we go. Okay. Fan art aside, let me just share this on Twitter. Sorry if this is getting boring. I'm just sharing. Junk. Okay. All right. So let's go to the video. God. Okay. So it looks like everybody can see the screen. So I'll just play it.
Do sugar pills. A new analysis has found that in the majority of trials conducted by drug companies in recent decades, sugar pills have done as well as or better than antidepressants. Companies have had to conduct numerous trials to get two that show a positive result, which is the Food and Drug Administration's minimum for approval.
Okay, this whole thing that sugar pills also help with depression, if that is the case, I think that can be explained by the phenomenon that the depression tends to resolve on its own in the majority of people, and then some people who continue to be depressed are put on medication after that time period. Oh, Kitty is saying hello. Can't see her, but anyway, I think he's not taking the factor that depression especially tends to resolve on its own, people will have like 1 or 2 depressive episodes, and then it will go away. And that's not due to thinking themselves out of depression. That's due to just the nature of the illness. And of course, the minority of people whose depression continues and they actually have clinical depression usually do need medication.
Do you need 2 that show positive results? You'd expect in the bell curve distribution of drug trials, you would get 2 positives eventually. You just keep running them until you get the 2 positive.
Yeah, and they did get the 2 positives. So I don't know what you're saying.
And then you say, look, we have a pill that cures depression. What's more, the sugar pills or placebos cause profound changes in the same areas of the brain affected by the medicines, according to research published recently. One researcher has ruefully concluded that a higher percentage of depressed patients get better on placebos today than 20 years ago. So what that means is, even if you're given a placebo, and possibly it's the care and attention given to the problem, to the person, that helps this, but the brain changes, whether you're on these drugs, which harm the brain, or you're on a placebo, which doesn't.
Okay, so he's saying that placebos change the brain, and again, their brain is already going to be changed if they have depression, and also because depression can resolve on its own, that could also account for it. But just sorry, I'm totally blanking right now. So again, the reason why the depressed patients are probably getting better on placebos is because depression has a tendency to resolve itself.
The new research may shed light on findings, such as those from trials last month that compared the herbal remedies in John's wart.
Okay, so I think he's making the same point. I'll skip a little bit.
Mind. Professor Nash is portrayed in the movie as having gotten better as a result of being on medication. This is not true. Dr. Nash recovered on his own, which is true of a lot of people with these kinds of disorders, and he'd been drug-free for 20 years, and he vehemently was outraged and protested the portrayal of meds in the movie, but of course.
So he's referring to John Nash, whose life was documented in the film A Beautiful Mind, about his struggles with schizophrenia. And yes, if he didn't use medications and just use therapy, I mean, that's good for him. But like saying that medication doesn't help because of that, and that he didn't have to still work through his mental illness, I mean, he's implying that the mental illness wasn't there in the first place. So, I mean, regardless of the use of medication, look, he still had a mental illness and he still had to work through that.
Didn't really achieve very much. In the US in the 1970s, the late Dr. Lauren Mosher's Soteria House experiment was based on the idea that schizophrenia can be overcome without drugs. Soteria clients who didn't receive neuroleptics actually did the best compared to hospital and drug-treated control subjects. Swiss, Swedish, and Finnish researchers have replicated and validated the experiment and are still using this today.
Okay, so if they've come up with a good type of therapy that can replace medication for schizophrenia, that would be great. I mean, I hope if that therapy really works, then then that becomes in wider use. But that doesn't mean that the mental illness itself doesn't exist. Like, what would there be to treat with that type of therapy if there wasn't mental illness in the first place?
In Italy, Dr. Giorgio Antonucci dismantled some of the most depressive psychiatric wards by treating severely disturbed patients with compassion and respect and without drugs. Within months, the most violent wards became the calmest.
So Again, that's good if this person was treating severely disturbed patients without drugs and with his own type of therapy. But you have to consider, if the psychiatric wards were considered very oppressive, then the patients are probably being mistreated, and just treating them correctly probably helped. It doesn't mean that we don't need medication. It just means that the psychiatric wards were not an ideal place. So I'm going to skip a little bit. So effects on teens and kids. In one trial, 75% of youth treated with antidepressants suffered an adverse event of some kind. What would you expect? A lot of people who are depressed have suffered some sort of adverse event. Look, it doesn't prove anything.
Treated with antidepressants suffered an adverse reaction of some kind.
Oh, so, sorry. He was meaning a reaction to medication. Okay. He just made it kind of vague with an adverse event. But to respond to that point, yes, antidepressants do have a profound effect on teens and kids, and that's why there's a black box warning, because they can cause suicidal thoughts.
In one study by the University of Pittsburgh, 23% of children treated with an SSRI developed mania or manic-like symptoms. An additional 19% developed drug-induced hostility.
Let me just view the chat, see if anyone's in the chat. No one's in the chat. Okay. Okay. So, I don't know if the mania he's talking about is drug-induced. He says drug-induced hostility. So, perhaps, but people with bipolar disorder often start out either manic or depressed, and then later it's revealed that they're actually bipolar and they have both. So that's not necessarily due to the SSRI.
Remember all these school shootings?
Oh yes, got to fearmonger about the school shootings. They were. I hate this argument because people love to fearmonger about it, and because what people do is that they will look at school shooters and they will see that they were on SSRIs, and they think SSRIs started school shootings. This is about the same fallacious research that makes people think vaccines cause autism, because it's conflating cause and correlation when those things are not necessarily the same thing. SSRIs do not cause homicidal behavior. They can cause suicidal behavior, but not homicidal behavior. Just because the school shooters took antidepressants doesn't mean that that's what caused it. It's more likely that they had a mental illness already and were being treated for it, because a lot of school shooters are mentally ill.
The trials revealed no benefit for depression, and all sorts of real problems were created in kids: mania, hostility, psychosis, and even potential suicidality.
Okay, if those problems were all caused by the medication, that is a terrible thing, and that's why doctors are supposed to exercise caution in prescribing antidepressants to kids. They don't always do that, but ideally they should.
This is why the recent black box labels have been put on these drugs. Psychiatry has, unfortunately, a strong history with racism. So, for instance, in Britain, black men are 10 times more likely to be diagnosed as schizophrenic than white people, and more likely to be prescribed and given higher doses of powerful psychotropic and mind-altering drugs. They're also more likely to receive electroshock treatment, which is 400 volts of electricity burning through somebody's brain, and to be subjected to physical and chemical restraints.
Okay, so if this is true, then that actually would be racist. But again, he's not really making a convincing argument that this is due to racism. I mean, it sounds like it, surely, and if it is due to racism, then that is a terrible thing. But I did want to mention on his talking about electroshock therapy, it's not so much electricity searing through your brain. They actually, I mean, it used to be that way, but it's actually done way more humanely now. They give you a anticonvulsant so that when your muscles twitch, it doesn't cause damage. And they give you an anesthetic so that you don't feel it. The only problem is that it can mess with your memories. And that's why it's usually used only in the most severe cases. But for those severe cases that are not responding to medication or therapy, it can be really helpful. I actually know somebody online who is doing ECT, electroconvulsive therapy for depression. And it is supposed to really help people. It's not the inhumane process anymore that he is trying to describe.
What's the biological basis for this? There is none. In the US, African American and Hispanic children in predominantly white school districts are often classified as learning disabled, more often than whites. This leads to millions of minority children being hooked onto prescribed mind-altering drugs, some more potent than cocaine, to treat this, quote, mental disorder.
Okay, again, that might actually be racism. I don't really know enough about this to say whether it is or not. But he's saying mind-altering drugs are more potent than cocaine. It's true that some drugs like Ritalin do have amphetamine effects, but from what I understand, they're not more potent than cocaine. Cocaine's a pretty strong upper. Just because kids are prescribed, say, Ritalin for ADD, that doesn't mean that it's the same thing as cocaine.
On the other side of the time pendulum, we have elderly abuse. So these tranquilizers, also known as benzodiazepines, can be addictive after only 14 days of use. Okay.
So it is true that benzodiazepines can definitely be addictive. However, they are not the same thing as tranquilizers. Tranquilizers is a bigger class of medications, including barbiturates and benzodiazepines, but they are not one and the same thing.
In Australia, the elderly are prescribed these psychiatric drugs in nursing homes for being noisy, for wanting to leave the nursing home, and for pacing.
Okay, if that is true, then that is really messed up. But again, because he's so biased, I can't really determine that.
In Canada, between 1995 and March 1996, 428,000 prescriptions for one particular highly addictive tranquilizer were written, with more than 35% of these for patients 65 and older.
Okay. So it's funny how he doesn't name the tranquilizer, he just says one particular tranquilizer.
This is livestock management. British coroner's reports showed benzodiazepines as more frequently contributing to unnatural death each year than cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, and all other illegal drugs. Okay, the reason why that is so is because A, benzodiazepines are easier to get, and that is a problem because benzodiazepine abuse is a real thing. But B, it's actually very hard to die just from overdosing on benzodiazepines. It is, however, very easy to die when you mix that with alcohol, and a lot of people will abuse both of those things. So that's the reason why it's more potent, or not more potent, more deadly than other illegal drugs, or illegal drugs, I should say. Antipsychotic drugs, such as Zyprexa, Risperdal, and Seroquel, place the elderly at increased risks of strokes and death, and have a boxed warning to emphasize the risk. Okay, that is true. There is a warning in most antipsychotic drugs that it can cause stroke in elderly people, which is why doctors, again, should exercise more care in prescribing it to elderly people. SSRIs cause suicidal thoughts and behavior. Paxil, for example, is 7 times more likely to induce suicide in people taking it than those taking a placebo or sugar pill, according to. Okay, that is true. There is, like I've said before, documented evidence that SSRIs cause suicidal thoughts and behavior.
Again, that's why there's a warning on a lot of them. Like, people know this already. I'm going to skip.
Members is prescribed psychiatric drugs such as Zoloft, Lexapro, Paxil, or Prozac, even though the FDA warns that antidepressants increase the risk of suicidal thinking and behavior in some.
Okay, two things. First of all, psychotropic drugs being given to soldiers is common because a lot of soldiers have mental illness, usually as a result of being in combat. So those drugs are used to treat their PTSD or depression or whatever they have. But it's funny because he's going to talk about PTSD in this next slide. So he's saying schizophrenia is not real, but PTSD is. Okay.
Combat veterans and PTSD. According to government data, 10 to 20% of soldiers who see heavy combat develop lasting symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And about a fifth of those who are treated are prescribed an antipsychotic drug. The JAMA report by prominent psychiatrists on the faculty of Yale University examined the treatment outcome for veterans suffering from PTSD, whose treatment with SSRI antidepressants failed and who were then prescribed antipsychotics. The finding after 6 months of treatment of veterans was that veterans who were prescribed Risperdal were doing no better than a similar group of 124 veterans who were given a placebo. About 5% in both groups recovered, and 10 to 20% reported at least some improvement based on standardized measures. Interestingly enough, whenever there's a major tragedy, the grief counselors come swooping in. Studies have shown that those who receive grief counseling are far worse off mentally after the event than those who receive none.
Again, he doesn't cite anything, so I can't really respond to this point because he doesn't cite his sources. As I've mentioned before, even though it looks like he's taking stuff from a lot of sources, the only sources I can find, if you go to this one link, which is expired, that's his only source.
Quote, "We didn't find any suggestion that the drug treatment was having an overall benefit on their lives," said Dr. John Crystal, the director of this study. Murder, violence, suicide. A lot of people have been under the care of psychiatrists and subject to these kinds of terrible drugs who had pretty wretched outcomes. Ernest Hemingway, France's great writer Antoine Artaud, jazz singer Billie Holiday, Julie Garland, Marilyn Monroe, Vivian Leigh, Kurt Cobain, the great Michael Hutchins, the comic Phil Hartman.
Okay, so he mentions all these celebrities that have had mental illness and have been treated for it and then later ended up committing suicide. So, but he's saying that basically they've committed suicide because of the drugs when he doesn't have any evidence for that. I mean, they could have been committed suicide because of their mental illness.
The list goes on. 66 school shootings and incidents have been reported or recorded involving these SSRIs.
Okay, I've already responded to this point. Again, just because the school shooter was taking SSRI does not mean that SSRIs causes school shooting.
Let's look at the physical damage. The brain damaging potential of Ritalin and other of the psychostimulants, most of them amphetamines, have become increasingly clear.
This is true. Oh, well, let me actually respond to his full point.
These drugs cause brain atrophy, that is brain shrinkage. Over the past 15 years, psychiatric researchers have maintained that the brains of children with ADHD, as seen on brain scans, were on average 10% smaller than those of normal control groups. Of course, what they have withheld from the public and their readership and professionals that attend their professional meetings is that virtually all of the ADHD subjects in these many studies over the past 15 years had been on long-term stimulant treatment, and that this treatment was the only physical difference between the ADHD subjects and the normal control group. Of course, their brains were smaller. It's a known effect of ADHD drugs.
Okay, so he's basically accusing doctors of conspiring to say that the brains of ADHD subjects are smaller when really that's caused by the medication. He provides no proof that the doctors are deceiving us. And he could very well be right, but he says these things and they look like they're cited from a source. They look professional, and really he doesn't provide any reasons for his conclusions. He's just taking a lot of data and interpreting it the way that he wants to see it. And you know, I'm blanking again, and just basing it all off his biased interpretation.
A study that was will be highlighted, I guess, was highlighted in Miami. Researchers found that brief low-dose amphetamine use in primates caused possibly permanent cognitive impairment.
Okay, so he's just citing one study, which will be highlighted at an annual meeting, or I mean, would have been, because this is a video from a while ago. But it caused possibly permanent cognitive impairment. He's just using all these, like, it will be, it's possibly, because he's not really certain about this study.
What about the antipsychotics? Well, these antipsychotics profoundly block dopamine receptors. They block 70 to 90% of the dopamine receptors in the brain. So the brain adapts. What does it do in return? It sprouts about 50% more dopamine receptors. It tries to become extra sensitive to dopamine. Like if you blind yourself, you become much better at hearing. So basically, when you give somebody antipsychotics, you're creating within them an imbalance in the dopamine system in the brain. So like on the one hand, it's like you've got the accelerator down, that's the extra dopamine receptors, and the drug is the brake trying to block this. But if you release that brake, if you abruptly go off the drugs, you now do have a dopamine system that's overactive as a result of this medication. You have too many dopamine receivers. And what happens? People who go abruptly off the drug tend to have severe relapses.
Yeah, which is why you shouldn't go off antipsychotics without permission from the doctor. I mean, that's something that's already known.
So, of course, if you're mucking up the dopamine system, you're increasing the risk of psychoses, which leads to another diagnosis and more medication. And when you look at people medicated on antipsychotics, you start to see a shrinking of the frontal lobes, the crucial area that makes us human, allows for higher functioning. Ritalin and cancer risks. So researchers fed Ritalin to adult mice over a 2-year period at doses close to those prescribed to children. The mice developed statistically significant incidences of liver abnormalities and tumors, including highly aggressive rare cancers known as hepatoblastomas.
This is kind of like the study where they gave mice, or I think it was rats, GMOs, and the rats developed cancer. Like, you can't really base your whole argument off of one study.
The National Toxicology Program concluded that Ritalin is, quote, a possible human carcinogen, and recommended the need for further research. You heard about this? Apart from cancer risks, there is also suggestive evidence that Ritalin induces genetic damage in blood cells of Ritalin-treated children.
Okay, that does not make any sense to me, because if it's a chemical that neurologically affects you and biologically affects you, how does it get into your DNA is my question. I mean, yes, Ritalin does have side effects. It is an amphetamine. You can become addicted to it, but I don't understand how it affects your genetics when very few things do.
All this for an illness that is not an illness.
Yes, it is an illness. ADD and ADHD are illnesses.
Concerns on Ritalin's cancer risk are more acute in view of the millions of children treated annually with the drug and the escalating incidence of childhood cancer by some 35% over the last few decades, quite apart from the delayed risks of cancer in adult life. We've been pumping this drug into millions of children. We've got a 35% increase in cancer. Researchers in Ireland reported in 2003 that since the introduction of the atypical antipsychotics, the death rate among people with schizophrenia has doubled.
The death rate among people with schizophrenia could be to due to anything. He's implying it's due to cancer, but he's not looking at the cases and determining how they died, because it could be, like I said, due to anything. Many people with schizophrenia unfortunately become homeless, and they could die from some incident, leaving that they're more risk actually for somebody violently attacking them, not the other way around. They could die due to that. A lot of people with schizophrenia have suicidal thoughts. They could be dying due to suicide. There's anything that there's many things that people with schizophrenia can die from. And the atypical antipsychotics, and I made a big mistake when I did my response to Black Pigeon Speaks. I conflated atypical and typical antipsychotics. Typical antipsychotics are the type like Haldol or Thorazine or Pimozide that have a really severe effect and can cause symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Atypical antipsychotics, on the other hand, do have other side effects, but they're less severe. And most antipsychotics used today are atypical antipsychotics. They really only prescribe typical antipsychotics for severe cases.
So according to the experts, psychiatry is a pseudoscience. So this is some approaches to what actually makes a scientific discipline. So this is some philosophers of science, especially Karl Popper. So
I don't get why everybody cites Karl Popper. Like, they act like he's some super genius, and I don't know, maybe he was, but they act like Karl Popper is this god, basically, because you see a lot of SJWs citing Karl Popper's, I'm pretty sure it's Karl Popper's paradox of intolerance, which is dumb. So I really don't know why these people have a hard on for Karl Popper, but
if a theory is going to qualify as hard science, it's got to have the following characteristics.
Okay. First of all, psychiatry, just because it is hard science does not mean it's a pseudoscience. There's a big difference between a soft science and pseudoscience. Yes, there are fields of psychiatry like psychoanalysis that are not based in science, but there are plenty of fields like biopsychology, neuroscience that are.
Parsimony, as straightforward as the phenomena to be explained aloud. This is Occam's razor, the most simple and brief explanation. Empirically testable and falsifiable. What's falsifiable about mental illness? Can't find it anywhere. How do you know that you don't have it? And people have gone, professors and researchers and reporters have gone into psychiatric wards and then have acted completely normal and have almost never been released, even when the other patients know that they're shamming. Psychiatrists never seem to.
Okay, just to respond to that point, there have been several studies where people have gone into mental health wards claiming they have a mental illness when they don't, just to see what will happen. And then they'll be kept in there. And that's more of a testament to mental hospitals not being a great place than to just the concept of mental illness existing or not.
Is the theory changeable? Were changes made to the theory as new data is discovered? Well, if these drugs are supposed to treat these illnesses and the illness gets worse, is the drug regimen changing? No. Progressive. It encompasses previous successful descriptions and explains and adds more. Provisional. It's a tentative. The theory does not attempt to assert that it is a final description or explanation.
Okay, so let's go over all of those points as to what classifies something as a hard science. Now, I don't think psychiatry or psychology is a hard science, but it does fit all of these requirements. So parsimony is straightforward phenomena to be explained aloud. When a psychiatrist is diagnosing a person, they go for the minimum number of diagnoses that explain that person's behaviors, and they only add on comorbidities when the person's behavior requires that. So they can involve empirically testable and falsifiable. We can empirically test the effect of therapy and drugs on mental illness. And we can empirically determine by the criteria in the DSM-5 or the ICD-10 if you're in Europe, if somebody has a given mental illness. Changeable, i.e. if necessary, changes may be made to the theory as new data are discovered. Yes, the DSM has been updated at least 6 times if you count the DSM-4 text revision. And the ICD, I'm pretty sure, has been updated over 10 times because it's the ICD-10 now, but there are, again, have been text revisions. So yes, it is definitely changeable. Progressive encompasses previous successful subscription and explains and adds more. There used to be very few mental illnesses listed in the DSM-1. Now there are, I'm not sure, probably close to 100 in the DSM-5. I don't know exactly how many. So yes, they do elaborate and change descriptions. Finally, the theory does not attempt to assert that as a final description or explanation. Yes, the reason why we keep changing the DSM-5 or the ICD-10 is because it is not seen as the end-all be-all for mental illness. So yes, it fits all of those descriptions.
How many of these does psychiatry accord with? Psychiatrists Colin Ross and Alvin Pam maintain that biopsychiatry does not qualify as a science on many counts.
Okay, just because 2 people said it was doesn't mean it doesn't. Biopsychiatry is actually linked to studying changes in the brain. So I don't say that's not science. It's funny because he wouldn't say any of this about neuroscience. And true neuroscience is more of a hard science than psychiatry just because it strictly deals in the brain. But the just biopsychiatry is very close to neurology in terms of what it studies.
Why is this happening? Follow the money. What's changed? Government funding. 73% of the approximately $23 billion spent by all mental health organizations in the US in 1988 came from public funds. And the FDA's funding changed in the 1990s. It was originally funded through taxes. In the 90s, an act was passed so that a lot of the FDA's funding came from the drug industry. So when drug companies applied for an FDA approval, they had to pay a fee. And these fees became what is funding a large portion of the FDA's review of drug applications. And, of course, the revolving door between the regulators and the industry leaders, between the pharma companies and the FDA, is well known.
Okay, if there's some genuine corruption going on in the FDA, I would understand that. I've never said that the pharmaceutical industry, sorry, somebody at my door. I might have to pause this stream. Okay. So if he's genuinely trying to expose some corruption in the FDA, I would 100% believe in that. I've never said the pharmaceutical industry is perfect. In fact, it can often be quite corrupt.
Conflicts of interest are legion. It's almost impossible to find a psychiatrist who doesn't have ties with a drug company to disprove any of these supposed studies. Involuntary confinement. This is a pretty strong civil rights issue, because each year approximately 1.5 million people are taken to psychiatric institutions against their will. It's one person every 75 seconds.
Okay. The reason why people are taken involuntarily to psychiatric institutions and put on 5150s or 5250s is because they are a danger to themselves. I have gone through this myself, although it wasn't exactly against my will. Look, what else do you want us to do? Do you want to just let somebody commit suicide, or let somebody harm somebody else, or let somebody not be able to take care of themselves? Like, what else do you expect us to do? If they need to go to a psychiatric institution, then they need to go. And I know that Stefan Malm is more of a libertarian, but and so he probably sees this as a freedom issue. But I mean, what else would you have him do?
Being confined against their will and drugged often. And wouldn't you know it, the chances that that person is going to be released are far slimmer if the person's insurance is paying for the treatment, if they are a cash cow. Let's just take a brief look at the history of the funding so we can understand how we got to this place. Community Mental Health Centers Act of 1963 created academic community mental health centers through government funding.
Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit if you just go into the history of how this came to be.
The government forces people to pay for mental health. And then it's much more profitable to invent an illness or a disease which can be treated by a pill rather than actually explore people's thinking and help them come to more rational conclusions about their lives, to understand where their lives need to change, how their relationships need to be solved, fixed, or abandoned.
Okay, so he's saying that people invent, or the government invents mental illness to make money. And just because these organizations are making money off of mental illness does not mean they invented mental illness to make that money. I mean, would you say the same thing about physical illness? Because plenty of organizations are making money off of physical illness. But he doesn't want to treat mental illness like physical illness because he doesn't understand that it is just as valid as physical illness.
And so the pharma companies pour all this money on the psychiatrists to prescribe meds, and the psychiatrists get all of this money to do that. They see fewer patients, they prescribe more. It's become, as again, one of the psychiatrists described, a complete racket. Monstrous. Look at the public funding of all of this. Medicaid is the largest source of funding, public and private, for the treatment of the mentally ill. Government money. Where you have government money, you have corruption and inefficiency. Medicare, of course, is the federally funded health care, which begins at age 65. Coverage includes mental health care.
No, please.
Federal government also allocates funds for the mental health care needs of military veterans. The Social Security Administration has two programs to help people pay for mental health treatment. The first is supplemental security income, while the second is Social Security disability insurance. So to be eligible for these, your mental condition needs to be such that you're unable to make a considerable amount of money by working. And
so I'm actually applying for supplemental security income now because my mental illness does affect my ability to work. I mean, I'm currently a student, but it makes sense that I would need some supplemental income. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially with Social Security disability, because that's something you actually pay into. You're investing into it, basically. Supplemental security income is more of the government pays you if you've never worked. But it's because you've never worked and you can't work currently.
You can see how this happens, partly through fraud, partly through faking it, of course, and because there's no objective test, so it's much easier to fake.
Oh, so he's saying that people fake mental illness to get money. I mean, I'm sure that happens, but actually to apply for Social Security supplemental security income, you have to provide a really extensive proof that not only that you have a physical or mental illness or disability, but also that you can't work because of it. Like you have to provide proof. It's really hard to fake.
And partly because these poor people get escalating amounts of meds because they're supposed to have these, quote, illnesses, which then begins to wreck their minds and renders them absolutely and tragically disabled, often permanently. In 2001, 52% of selected mental health and substance abuse expenditures were government funded. This is a much lower estimate than it is in reality, because this does not include Medicare for those qualifying for Social Security or disability insurance, or the federal grants to states for mental health spending. So in 1993 onwards, Medicaid legislation passed to build reimbursement for essential services for people with serious mental, quote, illnesses. In 1996, Clinton announced parity of health insurance coverage from...
Okay, so he's just going over public funding for mental illness. Regardless what you think about this subject or not, I mean, I think we can all agree that mental illness still exists. Let's see what else he has. Prozac, conclusions.
The past 50 years at all.
So even if biological illnesses are found, they do not justify the past 50 years. First of all, we have found biological differences with people with mental illness and people who don't have it. Second of all, what do you mean they do not justify the past 50 years? Working towards treatment of mental illness, and yes, a lot of it has been misguided, but working to treat mental illness is not a bad thing. But he claims mental illness doesn't exist. So
if I'm running a pyramid scheme or a Ponzi scheme, and then I happen to win the lottery and pay off a bunch of people, that doesn't mean that I wasn't running a scam for that long. Suffering and anguish are very, very real. And I don't want to minimize that or say, oh, these people just need to feel better or stiff upper lip or take a cold shower.
Okay, so if it's just suffering and anguish, I mean, why? So you're just saying if somebody has a legit diagnosable mental illness, you're like, oh no, you're just suffering from something. You're not mentally ill. Okay, and how do you explain, for example, people who become depressed because of a chemical imbalance and not because of any environmental factors?
I mean, this is very serious stuff. I mean, if anyone's interested, I mean, mental illness has afflicted my family just terribly.
Wait, you just said mental illness has affected your family terribly, but you also claim that mental illness isn't real. Pick one.
With electroconvulsive therapies, shock treatments, involuntary institutionalization. I mean, it's just been absolutely brutal on my family. The anguish is extremely real.
So he's claiming that suffering and anguish is due to the treatment of mental illness, not the mental illness itself.
Very real. It does not qualify, according to these experts, as an illness. And if I injure my back, then I have a real injury. I have a real injury which causes me real pain. That is not an illness. If I spend my days hunched over like a question mark and develop back problems, that is not an illness. That is an injury, a repetitive strain injury. I'll make the case as to what I think is going on, if you don't mind an amateur's opinion, in another video. But I don't want for people to think that I don't believe that the suffering is real. I believe that it is.
So we believe the suffering is real, but only because of the treatment, not because of the actual illness.
There are effective non-drug solutions available.
That is true. There are effective therapies for mental illness that don't have to involve drugs.
I'm a big fan of cognitive behavioral therapy. I myself was in therapy for many years, found it incredibly effective and powerful.
So, yes, cognitive behavioral therapy can be very effective. I'm undergoing it myself. It's very effective for things like depression or anxiety or OCD. But what do you think the cognitive behavioral therapy, excluding people who don't have a mental illness but benefit from it anyway, like, what do you think the cognitive behavioral therapy is there to treat? It was developed on the presumption that depression exists because of cognitive problems, or anxiety exists because of cognitive problems. And now it's not exactly how people view things. It's more of, yes, there are problems with cognition, not like intellectual problems, but just problems in the way you see yourself, in addition to chemical problems. So it's both of those things.
So there are non-drug solutions that are available which last in a way that these drugs don't. So thank you for your patience for this rather lengthy presentation. You can have a look at the sources for these this data at fdrurl.com/mental illness. And thank you so much for taking the time.
Okay, so again, that one link is expired, so I can't even check his sources. But that was this video. The next video I'm going to do is going to be on otherkin, so that should be fun. I just wanted to respond to the rest of this video because I didn't want to make a whole other 3 parts of this video. Yeah, so I hope you guys enjoy this video, and thanks for watching.